Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Ilyas Mhanna, and I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. It's wonderful to see so many folks here. We're live streaming this event on YouTube, and it'll be available afterwards too. I would like to thank the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies for co-sponsoring the event, and also to say that the event is made possible by the Peter Green Lectureship Fund on the Modern Middle East. I'm very happy to introduce our featured speaker for this evening. Dr. Joshua Landis is Sandra Mackey Chair and Professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, where he directs the Center for Middle East, or co-directs the Center for Middle East Studies and directs the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies. He is a world-renowned expert on Syrian politics and has published widely in journals such as Foreign Affairs, Middle East Policy, and Foreign Policy. His book, Syria at Independence, Nationalism, Leadership, and the Failure of Republicanism, will be published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies this coming year. He is a frequent analyst on TV, radio, and in print, and is a regular on NPR and the BBC. And just on a personal note, Josh and I go back almost 20 years now. I first came across his work when I was a graduate student, and he was writing a blog called Syria Comments. Some of you may have read that blog. I felt very schooled reading that blog back in the day and participating in the comments section, and it eventually inspired me to start a blog on Lebanese politics and then get into the world of journalism and public commentary on Middle East politics. And I've learned a lot from Josh over the years, and I'm delighted that he can be with us today. We're also joined by Professor Nina Tannenwald, who is senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science here at Brown. Her research focuses on the role of international institutions, norms and ideas in global security issues, efforts to control weapons of mass destruction, and human rights and the laws of war. Her book, The Nuclear Taboo, the United States and the Non-Use of Nuclear Weapons Since 1945, won the 2009 Lepgold Prize for Best Book in International Relations. So we're planning for a wide-ranging discussion, unstructured, for about 45 minutes, the three of us up here, and then we'll open things up for questions for another 45 minutes or so. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Landis to Brown. Okay, great. Am I okay, Robert?
Yeah, no, he was happy.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'm short. Okay, great. This is on. Okay, fantastic. So I think our plan here is to just begin maybe with a broad brush account of how we got to where we got. For those who are not following Syrian politics very closely, in December of 2024, the end of last year, the reign of the Assad regime came to an end in Syria after 13 years of civil war and 53 years of authoritarian rule. So the question is, could you set the stage for us? What had been happening in Syria over the past few years or so that enabled this stunning collapse to take place?
On?
Yep.
Hello, everybody. It's a delight to be here at Brown amongst so many wonderful people, and I must thank Ilyas Mhanna for inviting me here and for all the other wonderful dignitaries who are here as well. Let me jump in by saying what we saw 2 months ago, a month and a half ago now, is really the end of a post-colonial era. Now, what do I mean by that? Everybody likes to talk about post-colonialism these days, but in Syria, I think you can make a very good argument for that, because what happened is that the French occupied Syria between the two world wars. In 1920, they marched over the mountains from Beirut. They blew apart the teeny Syrian army that King Faisal of Syria had put together to defend at Maysalun. And They mowed them down with cannons and so forth, and they went to Damascus. And they ruled until 1946. And in order to rule, they pursued a classic colonial strategy, which was divide and conquer. And so they used the minorities, in particular, also Sunnis from the countryside, to fight against the nationalists who were anti-French and who were making trouble for them in the cities. And the nationalists were, by and large, Sunni notables led by the Sunni Arab notables of Syria, who were in the four big cities, Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, right up the spine of Syria. And where do those minorities come from? The minority of interest for us is the Alawites. And they're in the green part that you see on the map, on the coastal area. And they're about 12% of Syrians when the French arrived there. They were the lowest of the low in Syria, the very poor, dirt farmers. And in no village or city of over 200 people did Sunnis and Alawites live together, because the Alawites were shunned as heterodox Muslims. And there were Christians living with Alawites, Christians living with Sunnis, but not Alawites and Sunnis living together. The Alawites flooded into this French army that was built by the French in disproportionate numbers, so that when the French left in 1946, the Alawites were non-commissioned officers. By 1955, we have some statistics, about 55% of the non-commissioned officers were Alawites. There was a whole series of coups in Syria, very unstable after independence. And as officers got purged and kicked out at the top, the Alawites went up the food chain until they could take power through the Ba'ath Party. And in 1970, Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, took power from a fellow Alawite, Jadid, but it stopped the insecurity. And Syria got this dictatorial regime run by one Alawite family that heavily leaned on the Alawites. Even though the Ba'ath Party was supposed to be Arab nationalist and forbid the mention of sectarianism, ta'ifiyya, it became a taboo word. What he was relying on were these traditional sectarian family loyalties in Syria, even though everybody was supposed to be just a Syrian and not have these subnational loyalties. So, for example, during the Civil War, 40 of the top generals, all 40 of the very top generals in Syria were all Alawite. And that's the way he had coup-proofed his regime, and it's the way he held it together. His brother was the head of the security forces and so forth down the line. So he used these traditional loyalties to hold Syria together and to keep himself as dictator. And that meant that this is a post-colonial order. Sunnis rose up against this through the Muslim Brotherhood, which became the main opposition group. Already in the 1970s, 82, there was a big Hama massacre in the fourth largest city, Hama. I was living in Damascus at the time, and across the corridor from a bunch of Hamawis. One guy whose 20 members of his family was killed, but the government circled the city because Hama overthrew the Baathists, killed about 50 of them, and declared jihad against the regime, hoping that the rest of Syria would join in. They didn't. Assad surrounded it, smashed them, blew apart the center of town completely. And I could go visit a week after it was blown apart, which I did with a French friend of mine. And we were allowed to drive around the town because he wanted people to see what happens to you if you rise up against the regime. And that was the nature of this security state. And so why did he fall? He fell because this was a minoritarian regime that had become more and more dependent on security, and Bashar, the son, was a much less capable leader. He thought by opening up the regime allowing satellite TVs, allowing the internet, allowing Facebook and all the other communications with the outside world would endear Syrians to him. But of course, it had the opposite effect. Syrians could see the outside world and they wanted more and more freedom all the time. And they demanded it. And with the Arab Spring, those demands came to Damascus and started in Daraa, a little city in the south. But the point was that Syrians had had enough. He, of course, used brute force. He was very fearful that if you allow for freedom, the Muslim Brotherhood will take over. And essentially, that's sort of what's happened. He wasn't wrong in that fear because his regime was really built on this small 12% Alawites. The Druze down those blue areas right there are about 3%. The Christians are probably less than 5% today because they've been leaving. After World War II, Christians were about 15% of Syria, but today they're probably less than 5% because they've all been trying to get out. And Kurds are 10%, and they're very much in the news today, and they're in those cross-hatched areas. But today, the Kurds, thanks to America, own 30% of Syria, 25, 28% north of the Euphrates. Everything north of that big river going through there is now led by a Kurdish administration. So, but this minoritarian regime lost the Sunnis who had been key to supporting it at a certain level, all went out after the Arab Spring, 2011, and began to protest. And then when they were shot on, scales fell from, not that many people were deceived by the regime, but those who were really departed. And so the regime began to lose more and more of its internal support. Then the other major factors were Israel destroyed Hezbollah, largely, or decapitated it, in the months before the overturning of Assad. And Assad was in power in large part because neighboring states wanted him to stay in power. And in this larger struggle between Sunnis and Shia in the Middle East, the Shia sent militias because the Alawites are a Shiite offshoot. They sent militias to protect him. So Iraq had sent many militias, Iran had sent part of their army, and Lebanon, Hezbollah, the Shiite militia in Lebanon, had sent a lot of supporters, and they were key factor in his ability to stay in power. If you take the area between Lebanon and Iran, the Arab area, so Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, there are more Shiite Arabs than there are Sunni Arabs. Syria is vastly majority Sunni Arab. It's 70% Sunni Arab. So Sunni Arabs could never understand how these Alawites were keeping power, but they were keeping power because the neighbors, the other Shiites, who wanted to keep Iran as the leading power in Syria, keep Hezbollah armed, and the only way that arms could get from Iran to Hezbollah were through Syria. So Israel smashed Hezbollah, and that weakened him. Iran had also been bombed. And when Iraqi militias tried to send support across the border, America bombed them right at the edge of the Euphrates there and wouldn't let them in to support Assad. And Russia was completely preoccupied with Ukraine and hadn't been sending new airplanes or any reinforcements to Assad. So all of Assad's allies dried up. America had very crushing sanctions on Syria since 2011. So the economy was broken. An officer in the Syrian army was making $30 a month. An enlisted man, $10 a month. This meant that in places like Aleppo, which was the first city to fall, most officers had sent half of the men under their command home because in order to feed their families, they would take their salaries and use them to feed their families because there was not enough money. So they would just allow their troops to leave. And it was a very corrupt situation. And the Syrian government collapsed. Nobody wanted to die for it anymore. And we didn't realize that Ahmed Shara al-Jawlani and this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organization that he ran, was being armed by Turkey. And the militias up there were being modern arms. When we saw them in their new uniforms, they had night vision goggles, they had super good arms and jeeps and so forth. The only place they could get them all was from Turkey. So Turkey had been building that up. And I was very surprised when Aleppo fell because I didn't realize, I thought the rebels had largely been defeated. But they were there and they were ready and they were full of vim and vigor, just as the Syrian army had really just wasn't going to fight anymore. And that is really, that tells the story of why this really flipped in a big way, changing the whole security structure of the northern Middle East. So there's a long-winded answer to your.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about al-Jawlani, who is the leader of this organization, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who is now going by, so al-Jawlani is his nom de guerre, it's the name that he took as a fighter. He is now reverted to his civilian name, Ahmed al-Shara. And his, there's a lot of questions about who this person is and what the organization he is, what it represents, his background. Well, I'll let you get into this.
Ahmed al-Shara, I should have a photo of him here, but I don't, is, as a young man, he grew up outside of Damascus in the south. His family is traditionally from the Golan Heights right here. But he comes from a very good family and a learned family. He, as a young man in 2003, went off to Iraq to fight against the Americans. I was living in Damascus on and off throughout just before the uprising. And I noticed that once America had invaded Iraq in 2003, I spent the year in 2005, tons of university students, and I had gone to the University of Damascus for a year as a Fulbright student previous to this. But a lot of the students at the university started wearing Afghan clothes, sharwal kameez, which is totally foreign to Syria. But they would wear the little Afghan hat because it was like hippies in America in the 1960s. It was the cool thing to do, to show that you were with jihad. And that wasn't a big, giant phenomenon, but you would see people walking around the streets. And that's because they were going to fight in Iraq. And Ahmed Shara was one of these who went off to fight in 2003 to Iraq, where he teamed up with al-Qaeda. And if you remember, Zarqawi in Iraq really led the opposition to the Americans. And he teamed up with al-Qaeda. He was arrested for 5 years, put in 2 different American prisons. One of them, what's the name? I'm going to get it wrong. But he was put in with the person who would become Caliph Baghdadi, later the head of ISIS, who was the head of al-Qaeda, became the head of al-Qaeda first, but then as he became more grandiose, turned it into ISIS, the Islamic State. Ahmed Shara worked closely with him, and he was sent to Syria in 2011 to start a branch of al-Qaeda in Syria called al-Nusra. And he did a phenomenal job. He organized it very quickly. It became a dominant militia, and particularly in the north of Syria. Then when Caliph Baghdadi wanted him to give him bay'ah and to become part of ISIS, when he renamed al-Qaeda in Iraq ISIS, Ahmed Shara said, al-Jawlani said, no, I'm giving my bay'ah to the leaders of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, to Zawahiri, and I'm not giving it to this guy. And they fell out and they went to war against each other. And ISIS and al-Qaeda fought against each other. But by 2015, al-Qaeda was a major militia in the western part of Syria. So how did he change? And he has changed pretty dramatically. In 2016-17, Assad destroyed the militias with Russian help. Russia jumped into this in 2015, September 2015, Russia jumped into the civil war and gave them lots of airplanes and began to send their pilots who flew air power. And America, in a sense, and America and Russia sort of divided Syria up. America had been a big supporter of the opposition, and then it switched to the Kurds, because once ISIS grew into a real major power and he thought that Damascus might fall to ISIS, America got spooked by the opposition and then sided with the Kurds, used Kurdish nationalism to destroy ISIS. And ISIS was trying to push the Kurds out of northern Syria into Turkey. Big battle of Kobani, which has just had its 10th anniversary. So America jumped in north of the Euphrates, Russia jumped in south of the Euphrates. They divided up Syria, and Russia helped Assad win back to Aleppo. Very bloody fight. Ahmed Shara Jolani his force was pushed up into Idlib province. You can see it up there, where Idlib, and he set up camp and became the ruler of this small little province. And everybody thought, good, he's gone. But Turkey continued to support him. He changed his name to 2 different name changes until Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is sort of like the Syrian liberation, the Levantine Liberation Organization. That's what it means. And everybody thought it was over. But he ran a pretty good operation in Idlib. Most of the journalists and others who who visited during that period said he was running a pretty tight ship. And he managed to keep his militias together, and he purged most of the international fighters because he was trying to make himself look good to the foreign powers, because he needed foreign powers to fund him. He needed NGOs. He started a lot of women's education in the universities. Of course, they were wearing niqab at the time, but he made the accommodations he needed to make to do women's education, to get a lot of foreign NGOs in, and Turkish support. So, and Qatari money as well. So he was working the international scene at a time when Bashar was arrogant and didn't work the international scene, didn't make friends with the Kurds, which he should have done, didn't accommodate Russia, refused to meet with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, who asked to meet him and make some kind of compromise. And Assad said, no, I won't meet with you until you pull out of all of Syria. So he lost his allies at a time when al-Jolani was making allies. And so Jolani has shown a real capability. And then when he took Damascus and began to give interviews, my wife, who is an Alawite, and would normally not like him at all, or my mother-in-law, who lives in Latakia, fell in love with the guy. His Arabic was so beautiful, he was charming, he said all the right things, he talked about development, the developing nation, and we just want to build the economy, and we're going to get rid of the socialism. And so he began saying, and all the different ethnicities and religious groups have a role to play. Now, fall in love may be a bit of an exaggeration, but they were so relieved when, during that first day, the family spoke on WhatsApp, and my brother-in-law, who's living in Latakia, is married to a Christian woman, have children. They were terrified of, what should we do? Should we stay in Latakia? Or should we go to the village? And every household, every minority household was thinking that way, particularly the Alawites, who were so complicit with the old regime. And he decided, we said, you should go to the village because you don't want to be the first Alawite that they find. And I was thinking France, 1944, because when Hitler was driven out and the Vichy government was driven out of France by the Allied forces, by American forces with the Free French, 1944, and de Gaulle marched into Paris, 10,000 French people were killed in a few months. There was a lot of very rough justice because the collaborators, women who had slept with Germans had their heads shaved, and a lot of people were just hung up. And so that was the fear, that was going to happen in Syria. And to a certain degree, it is happening, not at that numbers, but that kind of, that was the worry. He went to the village thinking, well, they won't get to the village until afterwards. And, but after 4 days, his kids were bored being in the village and they drove back and nobody stopped them. There was no roadblocks. They went to Latakia. Everything was fine. And then the Christians in the Christian quarter, he lives in the Christian quarter, and the Christians normally put up a Christmas tree. And they were all wondering, should we put up a Christmas tree or not put up a Christmas tree? And finally they decided, okay, we're just gonna put it up and see what happens. And so they put up this big Christmas tree that they have in their square, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham came and helped them put it up. And they were very accommodating. And at the time, they were trying to show the West and the world that, you see, the Christians, that we're good. Now, there was a Christmas tree, a few Christmas trees that were torn down and burnt in little villages, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they went viral on video, and everybody said, you see, these guys are still Al-Qaeda. And then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham sent people out to help them put up their Christmas trees and so forth. But there's a lot of rough justice going on. And Ahmed Shara, to conclude this little bit on who he is struggling now to build a new police force. He only had, we think, about 25,000 soldiers with him when he took Damascus. He's got to run a whole country, almost the size of France. So he has to upscale really quickly. He's building a police force of 200,000 men. And now we've seen the videos of the graduation ceremony of these first Kharij from the graduates. And the commandant is saying, Dasturina, Dasturina, and then the graduates have to chant. They say, Al-Quran, it's the Quran. What is our constitution? What is our constitution? The Quran. Sabilina, Sabili, what is our way? Jihad is the answer. And so you have things, the lower downs in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are still pretty Islamist. And this is the new police force. Now, of course, the old police force was heavily invested with Alawites. And the question is, will Alawites have a place in the military, or will they be purged? These are the big questions that are still unclear how that's all going to work out. But of course, the minorities are very frightened that they're going to be purged, which they probably will be to a large degree. And so he's doing his best. His foreign minister just went to Davos. They gave, NPR just had a interview with the governor of Damascus who said, we want peace with Israel, leaned over backwards to say, we have no fight against Israel. In fact, we thank Israel for destroying Hezbollah so that we could win. And 2 days later, Ahmed Shara had to renounce the governor and say he wasn't speaking for the government. But he clearly was when he said this, or he thought he was. But so Ahmed Shara is trying to find his way. He wants peace because America has very strict sanctions on Syria, and the country needs to grow. It is broken. There's no money, and he needs to find a way out. And for that, he has to kiss America's hand, and that means Israel's hand as well, to a certain degree, and show that he's going to be a good neighbor, and that he's going to accommodate the minorities, which are the things that America's asked him to do. And he's trying his best to do that in a very chaotic situation where there isn't really a police force, and there's a lot of irregularities going out in the countryside.
Is it working? Yes, it is. So let me just pick up on this. I I want to ask about the direction where you see him going. I mean, you mentioned the Islamist issue, and that seems to me very important because he has promised, he sort of promised a Syria for everybody and said it will be a diverse government, but yet a lot of the appointments now in the ministries and the commanders in the military are all Islamists, and lots of them are from Idlib, right? So all the appointments are Islamists. And I mean, these are the people he knows, of course, right? But it takes a while to create a new government. And if, there's going to be a constitution writing process, but now he said it may take 3 or 4 years until there are elections. And so the longer you have this placeholder government in with Islamists, it's harder to imagine it, becoming a multi-party system. And of course, we have the track record of all the other Arab Spring states who began as diverse coalitions demanding some kind of diverse democracy and ended up as Islamist states. So my question is, given the trajectory that seems to be emerging, what is going to influence him? There's the question of outside actors, and of course there's the line that, Syrians should build Syria themselves, but of course there are many outside actors who are playing a role, who may have some influence. Who can influence this? Who should influence this? It can't just be him making decisions by himself, or is that what it is?
I think he is making decisions by himself. Everybody's looking to him. He's got this small cadre of Idlib people, many of whom are very Islamist, and some of whom are sophisticated, worldly, and have this larger vision, but others who really believe in Sharia law, that is the key to cleaning up the country. How he is going to build those cadres out, there are the institutions in Syria have fallen apart. Government offices are closed. There's going to be wide-scale purges. And, even in something like the Ministry of Education, 6 of my wife's aunts are teachers. The Ministry of Education is filled with Alawite teachers. They don't wear the hijab. They're going to be seen as enemy suspects in this Ministry of Education because you want the new youth to be taught the right things. And they're going to have to be purged from that ministry, and you're going to have to build they just got a new director of education for Latakia. That's that coastal city you see up on the map there. And once he was appointed, his educational background is graduating from Sharia College in Idlib. And videos immediately began to surface once he was appointed from last year, where he's talking about the Nusayris as nejis. That means Nusayris is a derogatory term for Alawites, but nejis is a Quranic term of impurity and dirtiness. And, of course, people begin to say, well, that's the end of my career in the education department. And but the question is, what values are going to be taught in school? How is this, what is the education? Has been full of this Ba'athist nonsense. But we had a big script that came out from the Minister of Education, the new Minister of Education, talking about getting rid of Darwin from the school stuff and a number of things along that line, so that it wouldn't interfere with God's truth. And so it led a lot of Syrians to wonder, what does that mean? And now Ahmed Shara is a very educated guy. I think he's going to try to, but it's going to be very difficult because he doesn't have the cadre. And he's going to face a number of conflicts against the Kurds and America, against Israel, which has occupied a whole bunch of new territory right along the edge of the Golan Heights here, and against the Turks, ultimately, who occupy a bunch. Let me just switch this we're going to go one here. Okay. This is really the disposition of forces today. All this gray area is what he owns and where his military is. This is desert, and it should be sort of the gray because nobody's in here. But there is, in the northern part of the desert up here, there's ISIS cells. This is America. America has all this area because it wanted to stop the main highway that went from Damascus to Baghdad over there. And so Tanf, there's American troops here, and they have a militia there. So they own that big blue area. But all the purple is Kurdish-led with American forces. And the Kurds are largely financed by America. And most of Syria's oil is in that purple area. And it's being used by America to fund the Kurdish militia. So Syria doesn't get its oil. And before the revolution, 50% of all government receipts came from the oil. So Syria is bankrupt, not only because of sanctions, because America is not letting him have the oil, and the Kurds aren't letting him have the oil. He wants that oil. He needs that oil in order to get back on the feet and not be another Assad who's broken down and so forth. So that's the dilemma that he's going to face, and because he's going to have to fight, he's going to need those fighters. He can't just fire them. First of all, he'll be overthrown.
He's going to fight. You mean physically fight? You mean
he's going to need to fight the Kurds. He's going to need to fight. He's going to need to have an army. So he can't.
On the battlefield, he's going to
have to fight on the battlefield, and that means he can't turn against his own supporters who came in town with him, who were his Al-Qaeda file. So he's locked in a bad situation because I'll give you one anecdote, and this was a big TV thing for an hour on Syria TV, which was a piano bar in downtown Damascus. Boys and girls, upper class, all very westernized, playing guitars and singing and so forth. Some security guy with a big beard came in and closed it down and said, "You can't do this, and girls and boys shouldn't be together like this." The manager of the cafe went to the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham police station, which wasn't too far away, and said, who are these people? They're claiming to be from Aman al-Am, from the security center. They said, no, they're not, but there's nothing we can do about it. Because these are other militias that have joined Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that helped them take Damascus, that are allied with Turkey. There are lots of militias up in that yellow area up there that are other militias fighting in the civil war that were backed up there and are supported by Turkey. They are part of this offensive. And they're taking security matters into their own hands in certain situations. But he can't fight against them because they're Turkish-backed and they helped him. But they're doing things like closing down cafes because women and boys are making music together. And he doesn't have the power to shut them down because he needs them. And so I think that's the situation that he's running into over and over again. And that more and more of these other people who came into town with him and have been fighting their own revolution, they don't feel like they have to obey him. And they're realizing, I can do what I want. And I'm going to do what I want. Because nobody's saying no to them. So he's in a very difficult bind.
Okay, before we turn things over to Q&A, maybe we'll have you weigh in on the path forward from a geopolitical international relations perspective. So with the new administration in Washington, Trump was president during the Civil War, a portion of the Civil War, and so now he's back. Is there anything that we can learn from his previous administration with respect to Syria as far as the way forward?
Well, he said, I want to get out of Syria. It's not our fight. And it's a bunch of sand and rubble, and let's just get out. He tried to do that his first time, but his national security team, who are very much sort of neocons, didn't want to get out, and they managed to stay. They convinced him to stay in. Now, he's said repeatedly he wants to get out of Syria, but his team is very much, again, both his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor have said that we should not get out of Syria. We owe it to the Kurds. We have an ISIS problem still, and we don't know which way this guy is going to go in terms of sharing power and so forth. So they took him off the designated list. So he's no longer considered a terrorist. There used to be a $10 million bounty on his head. But Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, his organization, is still designated as a terrorist organization, which means that it's very hard for international companies to go through the central bank. The central bank in Syria is still designated as a terrorist entity. So American banks, the international banking system it's very difficult to send money to Syria. So America is unlikely. I think America is going to try a wait and see. If he behaves himself, we will incrementally lift sanctions. And Europe just went through the first increment yesterday and announced that they were beginning to lift sanctions, but in a step-by-step measure, which is sort of meaningless because it's very difficult to get through the whole sanction regime and to understand it. So he's still in a difficult problem, and America wants to keep leverage. And that was the big discussion in the State Department. It was, I wrote an article earlier, right after this in Foreign Affairs, saying we should give up sanctions. Sanctions were meant to crush Assad. He's gone. They're crushing the Syrian people today. And he needs to rebuild or there's going to be no security in the region. And that argument, I think, has some purchase. But there are many others who say, no, if we give it all away, the sanctions, then we've got no leverage. We need to keep leverage because we don't know who this guy is. And Israel has taken Israel is another key in sort of figuring out how the administration looks at this. And Netanyahu is now saying, well, we got rid of Iran, but now Turkey's at our border. And Turkey may be a worse threat than Iran because it's a much more capable country with a bigger arms industry. So Israel's gearing up. And that's one of the reasons they took more territory, and they've bombed over 200 sites in Syria wherever there was military rockets or anything else that was from the Syrian army. So I think Israelis will push Trump not to withdraw. And the Israelis have been reaching out to the Kurds as well as a possible supporting the Kurds so that they can resist having a strong Syria that's centralized in Damascus, where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham would be able to rebuild an army and have the oil supply and so forth. So from Israel's point of view, a weak Syria is a good Syria. And that may be America's point of view as well. It's trying to figure out how to see this.
Okay, well, we have a couple of mics set up. If anybody would like to step up. I think we're going to have folks line up. Is that right? At the stands there. So if you wouldn't mind, yeah, Julia, if you wouldn't mind going to the. Great.
Is this working? Okay, fantastic. Thank you for your careful questions and probing remarks, Professor Landis. My name is Julia Gettle. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department here. And for those who don't know me, and for you also as a bit of a background, my partner is from Yarmouk camp, and which was the historic capital of the Palestinian diaspora. It was in the Damascus suburbs, was pretty much obliterated over the past decade. So this is quite, to a degree, familiar territory for me. So my question for you is, do you have any comments on two significant issues that are structuring a lot of the other conversations going on in Syria right now, namely the issue of the detainees and the missing, and the issue of refugees and returnees. If you could comment on the situation vis-a-vis Shura and the new and sort of the revived Syrian polity's attempts to deal with these two big structuring issues.
Right, and I will turn to Nina on this as well because, tons of my friends have gone back to Damascus in the last month. And anybody who's been paying attention to Syria and to social media, there's just been this constant stream of people going back who've been locked out of Syria for well over a decade now, and some, particularly with the Muslim crackdown on Muslim Brotherhood in the 80s and so forth, for decades. And everybody is going back to Damascus and just feeling the sense of relief and that we've gotten rid of this really nasty regime and hoping that something much better comes out of it. And they all want to participate in one way or another. And I think, and Ahmed Shara has been meeting with, roomfuls of these new arrivals, one after the next, and trying to reassure them and say, bring your money, invest, we've got a place for everybody. And he's been very good. You would think that there'd be sort of a class issue here of these rugged warriors who've been fighting with almost nothing and starving out there would turn their nose up at some of these foreign Syrians who've got money and come swanning back in and want to get their old houses and take over things and start rebuilding. But he's been very solicitous. Now, how many people are going to go back? We don't really know this. There was just an article today saying that 30% of the refugees in Turkey, which there are about 3 million, are saying that they're considering going back. But of course, they're not. For the poor people, there are no jobs. There are 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. That means you can't run a company because you don't have electricity. And schools are freezing cold in the wintertime. There's no money. So I think most people are going to wait till they can get a roof over their head and can have a job. And that's the real problem, I think, with going back. For the Palestinians, Syria is really over in many ways. They had to flee the Palestinian refugee camps. At the end of 1948, almost 200,000 Palestinians fled to Syria and established important refugee camps, which became sections of Damascus. And many of them were obliterated during the Civil War because they became battlegrounds and then the regime just bombarded them. And so, I don't think many Palestinians are going to go back. Although there are a lot of Palestinians that are intermarried that are just very much of a part of Syria and that didn't leave. But Syrians are going to take a wait and see, I think, for the most part. If that answers your question. The detainees and the missing. Well, that's a very sad story. Over 100,000 people have gone missing in Syria's jails. Assad really used the jails as part of his war effort, arresting activists and then killing them in jail and letting them die. And so it became part of the whole war. Over 100,000, and now we're getting these mass graves that are being disinterred. There was a big story on NPR this morning about that. And but you see pictures of these files in these various prisons, and all these reporters are going in, and the files are just sitting there in these rooms, and people are allowed to go through them, and they're scattering them on the floor because they're all looking for their relatives, and they're not being archived in any systematic way. The regime soldiers who were manning most of these prisons tried to burn as many records as they could, of course, because they didn't want their names to be there in the records. So it's a mess. It's a very big mess, and it's going to be an ongoing issue for a long time to come. Right? Yeah, this is.
Yeah. I can just add a couple of points to that. So every single international crime on the books has been perpetrated against Syrians. Every single one. So whether it's war crimes, crimes against humanity, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, siege warfare, starvation, direct targeting of civilians, including with prohibited weapons like chemical weapons, sexual violence, sexual crimes, everything. So it's just massive. And there are about, I think the number's like 136,000 people who have been disappeared. Probably 15,000 people have been tortured that they have records of. So that's one point. The second point is that these crimes are the single best documented case that we have in history. The documentation is phenomenal, in part because it started in 2011. So a lot of it has been done by human rights NGOs. Many of them are outside of Syria, but they're Syrian directed and organized. And they've been gathering documentation, and there's a lot of documentation has come out. It's the social media era. But there was the famous Caesar files, was a photographer who took a lot of photographs of, horrible atrocities. But the UN has also played a very big role here. So the UN Human Rights Council authorized a commission of investigation, which did a lot of reporting on the crimes and the atrocities. And then the UN Human Rights and the UN General Assembly in 2016, after it became clear that it was going to be impossible for the UN Security Council to authorize a referral to the International Criminal Court, there was a proposal that the Syria file case be referred to the International Criminal Court. Russia and China vetoed that. And so the UN General Assembly was looking for ways to do something to get around that. And so they authorized basically an investigative unit that has been documenting war crimes and basically collecting, evidence and files to be ready for prosecution when the time came. And they were expecting that this would be a long haul, a long time in the future. And all of a sudden, the regime has fallen, and now they have all this evidence. And there's, as Josh said, all this evidence from the prisons too. I mean, the UN people have already visited and tried to encourage the Syrian authorities to kind of keep track of this, all the files in the prisons, but they still do have a lot of evidence outside of just these prison files. So that's the silver lining here, but it's huge, right? There's so many perpetrators, there's so many cases. The justice issue is a giant project.
Thanks so much. I'm Alex Winder, Associate Director of the Center for Middle East Studies here. I have a question. You mentioned this idea of the Constitution. So I'm curious if you could say if there is any kind of discussion of a constitutional process, what that might look like. I know it was a huge issue in Egypt and Tunisia after 2011, and how that might influence the kind of atmosphere. And then I'm curious, you talked about a lot of the neighbors, and looking at the map, you didn't mention Jordan. So I'm curious if you could say a few words about, there's a huge number of Syrian refugees in Jordan. The Jordanian government is under a huge amount of pressure because of what's happening in Palestine. So how is Jordan kind of reacting and dealing with the change of government in Syria?
Great, I'll start with Jordan because Jordan, I think it's on. Yes.
Check.
There we go. Jordan has wanted the sanctions to be lifted. They were very aggressive in trying to bring Assad, quite aggressive in trying to bring Assad back to normalcy and into the Arab League. Why? Because of all these refugees. They wanted them to go home. They wanted sanctions to be lifted. And there had become quite a movement, both in Europe, 8 European countries, and much of the Arab League, wanting America to lift sanctions, normalize with Syria so the economy could grow, refugees would go back. And then all of a sudden, the regime is overturned. Now, Jordan and the UAE are in a bit of a quandary, and Egypt too, because they're worried about this new Islamist movement, which could, at first they were worried that it would preach jihad and Islamism and want to overturn more governments, that it would be an exporting revolution like the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Iranian Revolution, that it would want to export its brand of government to the wider Middle East. Ahmed Shara nipped that in the bud almost immediately, and he said the revolution is over as soon as he got to Damascus, which was basically him telegraphing to the Saudis and others, I don't want to overthrow you. And particularly to the Egyptians, who are very worried because Sisi didn't want the Muslim Brotherhood to take over. He's against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and he's a military guy like Assad was. So he's been very sort of down on this regime. And the UAE has been too, but Jordan to a certain degree as well. On the other hand, Jordan has been pushing stability and opening relations. It's opened the border. It's trying to get trade going. It wants America to lift the sanctions still, because if this government can bring stability and grow the economy, many of those people will go home. What was your next? Constitution, which is big, big importance. And that's where so many of the Syrians who are in America, in Europe, and so forth, who have drunk the constitutional Kool-Aid and see having a constitution as being the key to Syria's future, to having law and order in the country, not just another strongman. Now, Al-Qaeda was against the constitution, and Ahmed Shara, in his early days, spoke against constitution because the Sharia should be the constitution. But now he's talking constitution. Recently on Al Jazeera, he was asked when could it be in 4 years? And he said it could be in 4 years. So immediately the next day there were 20,000 stories that it's going to be in 4 years. There's going to be a constitution. He's sort of locked into 4 years now. But he's going to have elections in 4 years, but the constitution should be 3 years. That's what he said. And in March, he's going to have a big national dialogue, and when people from all walks of Syrian life are to get together to have a dialogue. But very little, lots of people are complaining that they don't have an invitation. He said, well, there's no invitations, you can just come. And it's unclear how it's going to be organized and who gets invited, because the Itilaf, the main UN-supported opposition groups that were supported by America weren't invited, and they were complaining, where is my invitation? And so the government said, well, nobody's got an invitation. And we'll see how, don't feel bad, nobody's got an invitation. So there's supposed to be this dialogue in a month and a half, and nobody knows how it's going to be carried. It's chaotic right now. That's the problem. But everybody's putting a lot of money on it. And the better educated Syrians are all hoping that they go back to the 1950 constitution, which was a beautiful constitution, which Assad tinkered with and others tinkered with later. But there were 6 PhDs on the thing, some from MIT and other places like that, who were on the council that made that constitution. So they have a good constitution. They have a good constitution. That's in the past. The question is, how much Islam will be part of it? And that's the big question mark. And will Ahmed Shara just be president for life the way Assad was? Or will he step down and allow for democratic process to take place? And that's where, America hung much of its rhetorical opposition to Assad on UN Resolution 2254, which says there should be elections, UN overseen elections, and the opposition should share in power. So America's sort of clinging to that in the hopes that there will be a constitution. And many Syrians, I think, are looking to that. But it's unclear. It's unclear whether that process will unfold that way, or whether Hayat Tahrir al-Sham will become the main party and there'll be another strongman in Syria. Yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Nadia Ali. So for me, I think that one of the important litmus tests to kind of look at level of authoritarianism, sectarianism, militarism, the whole range, is actually gender norms and relations, and the way that both gender and sexuality is being sort of dealt with. And here, of course, there are very bad trajectories on all sides, but I'm just wondering, so what is your sort of assessment in terms of looking at the role of these sort of hyper-militarized masculinities added with Islamism and then different sectarianism on top of that? I mean, looking at, so I looked, as you know, carefully at what happened in Iraq post-downfall of Saddam Hussein. And there, whatever the militia, whether the militia was Sunni or Shia, the first things they did when they moved into neighborhood was trying to control women's dress codes, women's mobility, gender relations. And I'm just sort of wondering, what is your sense? I mean, I know that there are lots of Syrian women activists who were already sidelined in the opposition. The regime tried to play the sort of gender card a bit, but of course we know that it was also one of the biggest perpetrators of gender-based violence. So I'm just sort of wondering if you have any sense of sort of going forward. I know I was in Berlin when the German Minister of Foreign Affairs met and wasn't given the handshake, and of course that was the main news in Germany, which is also problematic, of course, but yeah, I'm just wondering what you think.
Yes, the German foreign minister made a big splash because she came up in this fairly tight-knit little white costume, and he wouldn't shake hands with her. And then, of course, the West went crazy, and the Syrians also then defended and said, look, this is, you have to respect us, and why are you worried about these small things? They're just incidental. Well, the new Minister of Justice that was recently appointed, you guys are, I can see there's some Syrians in the audience who are, videos immediately appeared about him in 2016 when he was just first made a leading judge in Idlib, when Idlib was just taken over, very frontier justice. And a woman who was accused of adultery he pronounces the death penalty, and this guy steps forward and shoots her in the back of the head, and she keels over. And so we have there were a few videoed incidences of this sort of thing. And people have argued, well, look, that was the law at the time at this frontier situation, and it shouldn't be, things have changed today. But he's the Chief Justice. So how is that going to end up? There are a lot of these militia types who are trying to close down the cafes and are preaching in the streets. They've gone into, there were videos of in the Christian Quarter in downtown Damascus, these trucks coming in with big loudspeakers telling women to wear the niqab and how to do it, and this kind of thing. And it turned into a brawl. But that's not the government. And it's, how is it going to work out? Many Syrians say, we've been used to this for too long, we're not going to go. It's not going to be Iran, where all the lefty women supported Khomeini, thinking that they were going to get freedom, and ended up in the Chador. Syria is very diverse. And there are lots of people who don't believe in it because of their religion. There are a lot of secular Syrians who don't want to be forced to. And Ahmed Shara has said, we're not going to force anybody to wear the veil, to wear something they don't want to wear. Now, whether he can really put that into law, I don't know. But you're right. I think a lot of people are going to be nervous about this. And
Hi, I'm curious to hear what you think the role of Turkey is in the current government and to what extent Syria is now held hostage by Erdogan. And secondly, have Russia and Iran given up on Syria, or are they still trying to get grasp of power?
Erdogan, it's the big issue. I think Russia and Iran have really lost out. We saw some missile stuff. Somebody was caught today on the border with Lebanon trying to sneak military stuff into Lebanon. But the government people, HTS, arrested him and that was taken away. So clearly some military stuff there still smugglers are trying to get it through for Iran, but that's going to be closed down once this government gets. Russia, I think, will bide its time, and I think Russia will presume that Syria is going to have to invite us back. They're trying to renegotiate, but they've been pushed out. They tried to renegotiate Homeimim and particularly their port. But Syria is saying no-go at this time. But I think Syria will have to crawl back to Russia at some date. Why? For the same reason that they had to go to Russia in the first place. And if I can give you one anecdote, 1947, Secretary of State Marshall of the Marshall Plan promised Syria that he would help, America would help it rebuild its military and provide it with arms. Then in late 47, there was the vote in the UN for the partition of Palestine, which meant America was going to side with the Jews against the Arabs who were going to try to keep Palestine for Palestinians. And so Marshall wrote a letter to the head of the legation, the American legation in Damascus, and said, tell Shukri Khawatli, the president at the time, that we can't give you any arms and Congress will never pass this new military bill that was going to help retrain your army. And so that same day, we know from diaries of government officials, they already discussed on that same day of getting that telegram whether we should go to Russia. We have to go to Russia. Many of them argued, and Quatley said no because British will come against us. But they had to go to Russia because America was going to support Israel and then brought Turkey into NATO in 1952. So Syria had nowhere else to go to get arms. Europe wouldn't sell them arms. America wouldn't sell them arms. They're going to have to go. Where are they going to get arms today? They got to rebuild the Syrian army because Israel's occupying a hunk of Syria, Turkey's occupying a hunk of Syria, and America's occupying a hunk of Syria. The government has, doesn't have there's a lot of Syria that's gone. They're going to have to get it back, and they're going to need military power. So Turkey can provide that military power, but then they become enslaved to Turkey. Now, already, Ahmed Shara has said, we're not going to get most of our weaponry from Turkey. We have other Arab governments that have promised to help us. He is clearly going to Saudi Arabia. And I think America is encouraging Saudi Arabia to act as a balance to Turkey, because Saudi Arabia is very worried that Turkey will become dominant Sunni power in the Arab world, when Saudi Arabia wants to be that power. So they want to keep Turkey as bottled up as they can and not allow it to become just the super controller of Syria. And I think Ahmed Shara doesn't want the same thing, because Turkey wants to crush the Kurds in the north, and Shara does too, but he doesn't want to attack them. Turkey wants to attack them. So already you're seeing big differences between what Turkey wants and what Ahmed Shara wants. So he's going to have to go other places to get arms and to balance Turkey, to keep Turkey at bay. But right now, Turkey is everything to him. He can't make a move without Turkey, really, because Turkey owns a big hunk of the country and is supplying him with money, bread. All the electricity for Aleppo is going to be supplied now today by Turkey. And all the passports, all the ID cards, everything in Syria is being printed in Turkey because he doesn't have the capacity. He's sending all that information to Turkey and they're printing it all. So Turkey is the back room of Syria right now. Yes.
Hi. Earlier you mentioned elections. This is like kind of too tall. elections in 4 years?
Yes.
Like if possible. And
Elections,
I'm wondering,
elections for 4 years, Constitution in 3.
Yeah. I'm wondering like what factors you think are working for or against them having like open, free and fair elections, and if the US or Russia or other countries you anticipate them interfering.
Why not elections? Well, there haven't been elections in Syria since 1961. And they were interrupted before that, and there have been a number of coups. Because giving up power is hard to do, particularly if you don't agree on the rules of the game. Many people in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham want some form of an Islamic State. Now, the vast majority of Syrians, 70%, are Sunni Arabs. So the Kurds want a massive amount of autonomy in the northeast. There is a standoff between the Kurdish section and the government. The Kurds want 50% of the oil revenues. They want to have all their military force, 90,000 men, as a separate unit within the military that will police the Northeast. So they don't want to give up any of their military power. And they want cultural rights to teach Kurdish in the schools. So they want what Iraq has, what America gave to the Iraqi Kurds. Ahmed Shara says, no way, we're not going to do that. Turkey says, no way, we're not going to do that. There's a reason not to have, there's a reason why a constitution could crumble, because the Kurds have already said we don't want the constitution to have the word Arab in it. Syria today is a Syrian Arab republic. The Kurds say, we're 12% of this country. We're not Arabs. Why are you saying this country is for Arabs? It shouldn't be. It should be for Syrians. We can be Syrians, but we're not Arab. And don't exclude us. And this becomes a bad point of real contention. And then there's going to be Alawites who don't want Islam as part of the third article of the Syrian constitution today says that the president has to be a Muslim. Now, if Alawites aren't considered Muslims, and that they are by law, but that's a question. What's going to happen by that? So all of those are big questions that are hard to resolve. And elections would mean that a lot of these people who've just taken power and sweat and blood and sacrificed for 14 years would be thrown out of power. And they're not going to want to be thrown out of power. So those are the reasons why a constitution would fail. And do you want to make the constitution based on Sharia law or not? And I don't know how Syrians, if there were real elections, Syrians might, I don't know how do you think Syrians would come down on that issue? Can I ask my two Syrians here? 3 Syrians. What do you think?
I think there's this assumption that I feel like there's this assumption that all Sunni Arab Muslims will vote for an Islamist government, which I think is wrong. I don't think that all of them will. Maybe a good amount will, especially after the radicalization that happened over the past 14 years. You're gonna bomb people, bomb their houses, and just displace them into Idlib and put siege over them for 14 years. A lot of that causes radicalization, unfortunately. So there is a group of people who would want that, but I wouldn't assume that all Sunni Muslims will. How will that play out in elections? I really don't know. We're waiting to see.
Yeah, I think there's the same issue that, I agree, but I don't know. People are scared right now, and I was gonna just ask you too about what's the foreseeable future for minorities in Syria. It has always been not only religious, a sectarian issue, but more of a class issue back in Syria, and now the people are poorer than ever. And how is it play out for the future?
Can I ask you what community you come from?
My family is Alawite.
They're Alawite.
Yeah, they're in Tartus.
From Tartus.
Like they're fine. They felt like they were okay in the beginning. They were like surprised, but then I kept sending them because there's no internet and they can't be all the time checking the news and figuring out what's happening. So I kept sending them HTS and Ashara's in announcements and stuff to make them feel less anxious. But now there's this whole thing about halat fardiyya, individual incidences of killing, and that's what is distressing them the most. And it's a big issue in the coastal region that made a lot of Alawite even start calling and wanting to get the French mandate back, which is ridiculous. They've been calling, we need to plead. Yeah.
Right. The Alawites are terrified. There's a certain, because they're watching so much social media and they're having their sons send them all of these scary stories that they're collecting. It's not your fault. I know it's not your, but it's a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon because I know, lots of Alawites send me these stories every day in the hopes that I will bring it as an issue, that I'll tweet about it, that I'll write about it, and that I can make a difference, for example. And, it's like this French, reaching out to the French. This one sheikh, he called himself a sheikh, it became very popular overnight because a bunch of people were killed by these foreign fighters who'd set up in a military camp, 107, nearby, and they'd killed a bunch of people. And there are these incidents of revenge killings and so forth that are happening, and some of it's just banditry. And so the Alawites are terrified that this is going to steamroll and it's going to become much more. And so their status, they've gone from feeling secure in Syria and to now not knowing what it's like. And it's been a very rapid fall. And I think most of them, they're calling for some kind of outside protectorate. They want an outside protector to come and save them. Now, I know I lived in Lebanon for many years during the Civil War, and many of the minority groups in Lebanon felt the same way. It's America should come and fix it. Of course, that was never going to happen. But there's that. It's a sort of a minority thing, and I don't know. We just don't know what the future is going to be. Ahmed Shara is saying the right things, but right now it could go in many different directions, and we don't really know. It's a Wild West, particularly on the coastal region. And there's been, it's outside of Homs and Hama, there are lots of villages Alawite villages are right next to Sunni villages. And there have been a lot of irregularities there. And these military forces have gone in saying they're looking for the remains of the regime, these people who had been complicit with the regime. But they go in with guns shooting, they kick people, call them khanzir, and lots of bad names, and mistreat them. And so there's a very rough justice going on, and whether it's justice at all, it's just civilians being killed, and now there are some army officers, but it's unclear the extent to it. But both sides are yelling at each other. There's not a dialogue going on in the social media, and it gets everybody very frightened. So I can imagine Alawites are not going out. They don't want to go out of their house. They go shopping to get food. They come home. And because something could happen on the streets. You just don't know. You don't want to be that person for you run into something bad. So that's the situation right now. And everybody's waiting for a real police force to be set up and for the state to have responsibility and for a judicial system. There's no judicial system now. Which courts would you go to if you wanted to do this? De Gaulle very quickly was able to reestablish a judicial system in France, and then he could take these people, and then he commuted most of their sentences, the Vichy French. Just the way after the American Civil War, everybody was commuted. Even Jefferson Davis and the president of the Confederacy and Robert E. Lee were all forgiven. There were a few people who were convicted, and Wirtz was one who was the head commandant of the Southern prison system. And he bragged in his trial that he had killed more Yankees than Robert E. Lee because they were killed in prison, just the way in Syria, because it was used as a weapon of war. You put the prisoners in there, you don't want to give them back because they're going to go back to fighting, so you kill them in the prison. But I got sidetracked on that. But you need a judicial system, and the state needs to figure out and list who is guilty and who's not guilty. So it's not just a bunch of people going to a town and shooting up. Yeah. Thank you. Did our third Syrian want to say anything?
So we have time for one more question, Lubna.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a question about how grassroots organizations and the kind of developing civilian infrastructure that's been happening over the course of the last 14 years might partake in this next phase. I know that, many of us, Julie and I have had this discussion that prior to 2011, one of the things about Syria that distinguished it from a place like Tunisia, for example, during the Arab uprisings was like the absence of autonomous unions and grassroots civilian infrastructure in the country living under this authoritarian rule. But a lot has been developed kind of organically through popular committees on the ground in places like Sweden and other camps and neighborhoods. And the Syrian diaspora, whether it's in Turkey or in Europe, has established a lot of kind of civilian infrastructure that's always been limited because it's never quite been in Syria, but things around refugee resettlement, things around organizing structures. And I'm wondering if you think that these kinds of groups would have a role in this next phase, how you think Al-Sholani is going to be receptive to kind of the Syrian diaspora returning to partake in, state building formation at this time.
It's a good question. A lot of local committees sprung up during the Civil War. Many of them were clobbered by the militias that took over. So in the beginning of the Civil War, or the beginning of the uprising, there was a lot of community organizing and civil society. It got steamrolled by the militias, who were not interested in these local committees. But Syrians are organizing today in a way that I've never seen before, because all of a sudden they're free to do it, and there's hope that if they do it, something good might come out of it. And I think there's a tremendous amount of energy. I know there's just a tremendous amount of energy. And I think the hope is that will lead to a growing civil society. And there are examples in Lebanon and in the region where they can copy to a degree. But Syrians are not versed in this. It's new, it's terra incognita, because for 50 years, all politics was really shut down. And there were little moments like the beginning of the uprising and so forth where you did get organization, but mostly people have tried to keep their opinions to themselves. But today they're all speaking again. Now, whether that gets shut down over a period of time, or whether a new government is able to somehow accommodate it, it's the big question. And if you look around the Arab world today, there are some little bright areas, but mostly it's authoritarian government that hasn't allowed this kind of civil society to really blossom. I don't want to end on that note, though.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think this revolution just happened. It's an incredible relief to Syrians of every walk of life to get rid of a regime that had stifled, that had brought Syria to a total dead end, where there was no hope. And my brother-in-law's family, for example, who should have had hope because they're Alawite, they had every reason to be privileged. People outside who could send money and stuff like that, but they had no hope. All they wanted to do was get out of the country because the education system had crumbled. Corruption was everywhere. You couldn't make money. There was no electricity. Life is just a struggle. And so the only hope was to leave the country. And Syrians were leaving by the millions. There are well over 6 million Syrians outside the country. So today, there is that hope that has been restored. And I think Christians, and even to a degree, many Alawites feel that it could be better. They're just praying that the right series of things happen and that security returns and that the economy will grow, that sanctions will be lifted, and that somehow there will be a virtuous cycle of good things that happen. And that's the hope right now in this early revolutionary phase. Thank you.